Okay, so I want to talk about how to diagram more complex arguments. And I'll talk about that argument that I had about legalizing drugs in a minute. Let me just start with a simpler one, that I kind of made up, right? Like I said, I played a lot of Clue when I was a kid. Power went out, needed things to do. And so let's look at this one. Mrs. White, Colonel Mustard, or Mrs. Peacock did it. If Colonel Mustard did it, he used a gun, wasn't done with a gun, so he didn't do it. Mrs. White did it, it was committed in the kitchen, but it was committed in the library, so she didn't do it. So it had to be Peacock, right? This actually has a pretty complex structure, right? You know, 2 and 3 prove 4, 5 and 6 prove 7, 4 and 7 together with 1 prove 8. So how do we diagram that? Well, let's start. So let's just start. If Mustard did it, done with a gun. Wasn't done with a gun, so Mustard didn't do it. And that's number 4 there, right? Well, if White did it, was done in the kitchen, that's number 5. Was done in the library. So Mrs. White didn't do it. That's 7, right? I need to draw these a little more on the same level. Then we say, well, White, Mustard, or Peacock did it. Well, that's number 1. 4, 7, and 1 all work together to prove our conclusion, number 8. And look, I should draw my little diagram a little neater, you know. But one thing you guys will notice with this argument, it has different levels, right? First level, 2 and 3 and 5 and 6 work together to prove 4 and 7. 4 and 7 with 1 prove 8. This is starting to get more complex, but, you know, different levels. This allows us to see what's going on in this more complex argument. Now let's look at our drugs argument, right? I've cleaned this up a little bit from class. I made things a little clearer, but look, if laws against drug use worked, then prohibition would have worked. First premise. Prohibition failed, did nothing to prevent people drinking. So these together are supposed to show that drug laws don't work, right? Drug laws lead to civil forfeiture. Drug laws lead to no-knock warrants. Well, those together are supposed to prove that drug laws lead to violations of basic liberties. People have a right to do what they want with their own bodies. So people have a right to put drugs in their bodies, so we should legalize drugs. So let's start to put all these together. Obviously, 1 and 2 are supposed to work together to prove our conclusion. So we'll just put them here. But then we say, well, drug laws lead to civil forfeiture. Drug laws lead to no-knock warrants, so drug laws lead to violations of basic liberties. Now, if you think about this, 5, they lead to violations of basic liberties, is supposed to prove 8, right? What's supposed to support 5? Well, 3 and 4. Do 3 and 4 need to work together to prove 5? Well, no, they're both, it looks like to me, independent support. Each of these give us some reason to think drug laws, you know, lead to violations of basic liberties. So we'll draw 3 and 4 together are supposed to support 5. We have 7, so people have a right to put drugs in their bodies. 6, people have a right to do what they want with their own bodies. Well, how is this supposed to go? Are 6 and 7 both supposed to support 8? I don't think so. I mean, if you think about it, 6 seems like it supports 7, then 7 supports 8, right? 6 is about this general right. 7 is about applying it specifically to drugs. So I think, our argument looks like this, 6 down to 7. And then we think about it, well, 1 and 2 together are supposed to support 8. 5 on its own is supposed to support 8. And 7 on its own is supposed to support 8. And you will often see this in real world arguments. People will make a few different independent lines of argument for a conclusion. This guy's saying, well, look, drug laws don't work. That's a reason to legalize drugs, violate other basic liberties, reason to legalize drugs, and also, you know, violate this fundamental right we have to put drugs in our bodies if we want to. And so I want you to notice something we can do once we start to diagram arguments this way. This person gives us 3 lines of argument. And now if you just read this whole piece, this is all going to be muddled together. You don't know how to evaluate any of these lines of argument. Once you've diagrammed it, you can start thinking to yourself, well, let's look at these lines of argument individually. You know, did prohibition really fail? Well, and is it true that if laws against drug use work, then prohibition would have worked? Well, you might wonder about 1 and 2, right? It's like, well, okay, well, it's a lot easier to make alcohol than it is heroin, right? I mean, look, I could make alcohol in my shed right now if I wanted to. It's not a hard thing to do. You get some kind of fruit juice, some kind of yeast, wait, the magic happens, right? It's probably going to taste terrible, but it would get you drunk, right? I'm not going to do that, but you could. So is it true that we can learn from prohibition generally about drug laws generally? Well, maybe not. We might wonder about one. And is it really true that prohibition failed? Well, actually, there's a lot of research. Whoops, sorry. There's a lot of research that says, well, prohibition seems like it might have succeeded. All these diseases linked with alcohol, like cirrhosis of the liver and alcohol psychosis, they plummeted in the first few years of prohibition. That seems to indicate, well, it did do something to prevent alcohol abuse. So 1 and 2 have to work together to provide support, but I'm a little dubious about 1. I actually think 2 is probably just false, right? There seems to be some evidence prohibition did work. Well, if either one of these goes away, then this whole line of argument falls apart, right? But then we might think to ourselves, well, if one line of argument doesn't work, we still have these other two. And then we can think about these other two individually, right? Do we really have a right to do what we want with our own bodies? Is this enough to think drug laws lead to rights of other basic liberties? You know, I'm not going to evaluate the other two, but this when we break the argument up into smaller pieces like this, when we have a map, we can start to look at each piece and evaluate whether they work. If they don't work, is there still enough here to provide some evidence for the conclusion? And this whole method, we'll talk a lot more about as we get more into other parts of logic. It's just sort of, philosophers will talk about analysis. The idea is to break something big up into smaller pieces and see exactly how those pieces fit together, so you can take it one small piece, one small step at a time. And that will allow you to evaluate arguments much better than if you just try to read the whole thing and think about it all at once. So hopefully you're getting an idea how this works. You know, think about my other argument. You know, this one's really fragile, right? If it turns out, well, actually, we don't know what the murder was done with. Maybe it was done with a gun. Then the whole argument falls apart, right? This one isn't as fragile because, besides the first swing of the argument, we have some other reasons to think maybe we should legalize drugs. I'm not sure that they're convincing, but one whole wing of the argument can go away and there's still some reason to believe the conclusion. Whereas with this one, the way the pieces fit together, if any one of these claims is false, the whole argument falls down like a Jenga tower, right? So hopefully this gives you a better idea why diagramming arguments is valuable. It really allows us to see how things fit together and to take it piece by piece and evaluate it rather than just this whole block of text and argument and trying to think about it all at once. All right. So also hope this gives you some idea that, arguments can get very complex. You will often see, both of these arguments have two levels. The last one, yeah, they all have two levels. You can have three, four levels. They can get very complex, but the diagram gives us an idea of how it all fits together, and that often turns out to be very, very valuable. All right, so hopefully you guys are getting an idea how this whole, concept of argument diagramming works, and we will just do a lot more practice with this next class.